There appears to be some form of a plague in financial markets these days, as more and more absurd ETFs continue to get released every day. But one of the ETFs and ETF types that has been around for about a decade at this point is the income type of ETF, which in my opinion is terrible, and it has only gotten worse over time, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons for that being my opinion. Partially because I think the advertising on behalf of them is incredibly misleading, and there's a lot that's intuitively wrong with them, but there are also some other factors that are more mechanically against them as time progresses, as we'll see. This is the most popular of the bunch as it feels online these days, and in assets under management it is one of the highest, if not the highest. It is QYLD. An initial gut check will show incredible underperformance relative to the NASDAQ on both a total return basis and a volatility adjusted basis. It does not do its job of mitigating downturns, and it certainly does not do its job of generating any sort of outperformance through income generation via call selling. It is completely bogus in that respect because the call prices are generally so dampened as a result of heightened demand since the great financial crisis that none of these things outperform their underlying at all, and for the most part, they are completely horrible. Half of their alluring yield comes from nothing more than NAV decay, and the rest comes from selling options at prices a real person likely wouldn't. However, the fund is of course forced to every month, resulting in, as we saw, significant underperformance. Now, this isn't just true for the NASDAQ ETF, it's also true for others such as the TSLY Tesla Option Income Strategy ETF, which looks a lot better when it is adjusted for its dividends, but it still underperforms the underlying to a significant extent. Now, part of the allure of these is that they are supposed to perform well in a flat market, or a kangaroo market, as some might say. However, that is almost never the case, as you'll see here or in the Russell, who are more or less flat over the last few years. Despite that, the yield max strategies, or the income strategies, do not play well as you were advertised that they might. This comes out for a number of factors, but number one is simply that as a result of there being so much demand for call selling, they are selling the calls at too cheap of a price for the volatility that is being realized, and there are enough instances across these periods of time where the loss from the call selling in one or two instances more than offsets the gains from the rest of the periods, and that leads to staggeringly horrible returns. Even in something like the Russell, which has been more or less flat across the last half decade, achieving only a 50% return adjusted for dividends, the income version of this that seeks to mitigate volatility and add income in flat markets still underperforms significantly with an annualized return of under 5%. Horrible considering the fact that you are still accepting so much volatility risk holding such of a product, because in call selling you still assume all the downside risk in any major downturn. These products are simply not good. Now, keep in mind this is all opinion work for me, but I will show you some other things that have happened similar to this over time, one of those being put writing and the returns of put selling up until the great financial crisis and following it after demand increased. Since its start in 1986, the put write index has actually outperformed the SPX index when it is not adjusted for dividends, but you'll see that this outperformance both on a total return and volatility adjusted basis occurred really only until the great financial crisis, after which, because everyone saw the returns across that period, they all wanted in, and as a result, option prices declined significantly because so many people were selling insurance. Those prices got cheaper and the returns worsened over the next decade until eventually it was no longer even outperforming the S&P on a volatility adjusted basis, which sort of defeats the entire purpose of running such a system. And keep in mind, the underperformance is much more significant once we add back in dividend adjustment. So bringing us back to QYLD and the current call selling situation, we're witnessing something similar. Even though it already happened back then, we're sort of seeing it again, where the prices of these options that are being sold are even being compressed further, and we're seeing further underperformance for these ETFs. And this can be illustrated pretty well looking at some of the charts of assets under management for a lot of these funds, QYLD being one of the largest and oldest, seeing an increase from 2020 to 2022 of over 800%, despite the returns being terrible and continuing to get worse after that. But now with the rise of single stock ETFs, this continues to get even more potent, with MSTY, the MSTR option income strategy, now up to nearly $6 billion in assets under management. And keep in mind, there are other sister funds of this that do more or less the same thing with less assets under management who are also increasing. And as a result, once again, if we add back the chart of the underlying, we are seeing significant underperformance, as one would expect. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but it's also true for TSLY, continuing to increase in assets under management despite the underperformance and continued underperformance, or QYLD or NVDY or any of the rest. They've gained a lot of assets, they've continued to underperform, and they likely will. Now, of course, there's a situation that could play out where they happen to do well because markets happen to perform with less volatility than what's expected and all option selling systems work, but that doesn't necessarily prove the point of the idea behind these, because at the end of the day, they're still selling these options below the prices that they should be, or that any reasonable person likely would elect to if they weren't forced to by fund objectives and rules. And it has continued to lead into a system where almost literally all of these things underperform, have underperformed, and continue to underperform. And personally, I don't understand the allure of them, but we'll talk about some of that as well. Most of the allure coming with things like this, talking about the dividends and what you can do with said income, which is, of course, the misleading word here, because you'd make more money buying the underlying, selling it over time, than you would buying this and using those dividends to pay things. And I also believe it's more or equally roughly tax efficient. So it's sort of a literacy test in some respect of whether or not you know how to go and look at the total return charts of the stocks versus these ETFs and realize quite quickly that, hey, these all underperform. There's probably a reason for it, doing some research and figuring out why. And of course, there's posts like this talking about the performance of the dividend adjusted chart without also showing the underlying chart. And in that sense, it appears great. You think, oh, if I bought this, I would be doing well. And you would have, but you would always, in pretty much all of these cases, have done better just buying the underlying. And in general, it's just the talking point of yield despite not understanding what's really going on, talking about the returns of only the yield max investment rather than the underlying and not comparing them. That leads to the misconceptions regarding these products, and that they are, for the most part, poor. Things like this, touting the weekly dividend, things like that. It doesn't really matter if it's weekly or monthly. You can sell stock at any rate you'd like to if you just bought the underlying, because you're also assuming NAV decay with these anyway, so you're losing principal either way. Just spend some time thinking about that. And if you end up deciding that this is a product that you want, at least know deeply why you like it, rather than understanding that I get paid X weekly. You ought to know how that's being paid, why it's being paid, and what risks you're taking with the product that you're missing out on with the underlying. It's just like posts like this. A $10,000 invested then would be worth $41,000 now with dividends reinvested. And while true, you would have done great if you bought it, you outperformed virtually everyone. Fantastic. You still underperformed your underlying, and if you sort of knew what was going on, knew what your bet was, you might have made even more money. And a lot of trading and investing is getting the most out of your right ideas, because even if you're only right 30-40% of the time, if you make the most of them, it's often more than enough to cover the losses. But if you understand everything perfectly, you want to get to a situation where you're maximizing your chance at being right. Whereas for MSTR, your bet is, of course, that Bitcoin goes up. Why would you want to sell out your upside on what you understand to be an asymmetric bet on something that has extreme upside? It doesn't make intuitive sense in that regard. And obviously, it's a very volatile asset. And as a result of this, you're also assuming all of the downside with no protection in that case, aside from the premium. I'm not going to go out and continue through all of these, but you get the point. And it's also worth noting that I've been talking about this for a while, and I've had some bad takes back in the day, but I've continued to learn more, become more educated on everything over time, through as much as I can. But this is one thing that I have been consistent on over time. And so if you're viewing this and thinking, well, this is a great bottom indicator for these underperformances, I've been talking about this for well over 2 years now, and they're just not great products. So that about wraps it up. If you end up deciding that you really have a desire to buy these, there's a couple things that I would suggest you look into. One being, of course, these total return charts, see how they look compared to the underlying, see what your risk appetite is. And I would also suggest that you actually go through these current prices, go into the underlying, look at the option prices on the first and last of every month, and see what these strategies are actually writing these options at, the prices they're writing them at, and ask yourself if you would find it reasonable to be writing these calls at these prices. And don't look at it as a situation where you're long and you're writing calls so you're safe. Look at it as if you are only writing those calls, because at the end of the day, that's of course the difference between buying the underlying and the call writing is just the call writing. So ask yourself if you would find yourself comfortable just writing those calls, if you think it would be a situation that would have a likely positive potential, or if you believe it to be unreasonable given the chance of a rally, and just see how you feel actually looking at those prices. Again, this is an opinion piece, but take what you like from it and do your own research, make your own decisions. None of this is financial advice, but I hope you enjoyed. That's all I have. See you next time.